Good evening, everybody. Welcome to a presentation on the right to an education, educational entitlement, and the Ethiopian community experience in Cairo. Yes, this is one of the series from CMRS, the Center for Migration Studies. For all who don't know me, my name is Gerda Heck, and I'm teaching also at the Center for Migration Studies. Next to me is Anouk Wijtsma. She is sitting here. She is a student of the center. She just defended her master thesis on the topic on education and Ethiopian community in Cairo. Besides, she is also a student of law. On the, what is it? It's written down here again on international human rights. International human rights, and she is going to defend also her thesis in the end of this month. I think next month. On entitlement, refugee entitlement to education in Nepal. I'm sorry. Anouk has also worked for civil NGOs here in Cairo before. I think she was volunteering with STARS and also volunteering with Africa Hope. This is a school in Mali. Next to her is McNally. She is also a student from the CMRS. She already finished, I think, last year. She is currently the research manager of the Refugee Entitlement Project in Egypt. This is a project which is funded by the European Union, and it researches map refugees, asylum seekers, and failed asylum seekers' legal entitlement under international, regional, bilateral, and domestic law. She obtained her LLM, also her law degree in international and cooperative law, and her Master of Global Affairs from American University, where she researched focused on refugee access to education and international human rights law. Prior to this, she has been working in Jordan for 1 or 2 years, I think. She's been working in several NGOs there. And her future goal is to become a Juris Doctorate in law next year.
Maybe.
Maybe, hopefully. The two of them are going to present today on the right to education. Claire is going to talk about the legal entitlement of education in Egypt, and Anouk is going to give some insights from her master thesis. Thank you.
Thank you. Does this work right? Okay. So as Dr. Gerda said, my name's Claire and Anouk. And so the way the presentation is going to be structured is I'm going to go through the educational or the legal background to the right to education as it applies to Egypt. So what conventions they've signed, what their domestic legislation looks like, and how that sets the stage for what Anouk's fieldwork shows. Because the Ethiopian community in Egypt is one of the ones that is excluded from the right to education. Despite the existence of the legal entitlement, in practice here, the government does not provide it. And then Anouk's fieldwork comes in with looking at what are the informal educational opportunities that the Ethiopian community has found and has created for themselves, and how it impacts their experiences in Cairo. I will try and keep the legal part as brief as possible because it's the field work that's the most interesting, but
I don't would say.
So the background to the overall right to education is that international, regional, domestic law differs based on the level. So for primary education, it's supposed to be free and compulsory. That means that parents cannot choose to exclude their children. This was initially thought up in questions of gender and making sure children of all genders have access to schools. For secondary education, it's supposed to be generally available and accessible. That doesn't mean it needs to be free. So it is possible for a government to charge for secondary school, but that should not be a long-term plan, and it shouldn't prohibit people from finishing their secondary degrees. And higher education, university education, it needs to be equally accessible on the basis of capacity. A lot of conventions say it would be ideal if we move towards free university education, but as my country, the US, shows there's no right to have an affordable university education. That's pretty much where it stops. Across all levels, states cannot have discriminatory policies. So they should not say, based on gender, based on race, based on religion, some can access, some cannot. However, international law does let you make some differences between citizens and non-citizens, particularly developing countries like Egypt, which has a negative impact often on refugee asylum seeking, and particularly failed asylum seeking or just migrant communities. And overall, the legal framework focuses on access as opposed to quality. So while the laws do mention that the education should be of a certain standard, should promote human rights and certain ideals, in practice, very little is written about anything other than the fact that you can go to school. So very briefly, in Egypt, the international legal framework for education is the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Interestingly, one of the articles, Article 14, says that within 2 years of ratifying the convention, states are under an obligation to show what their plan is for providing free and compulsory primary education to all students. Egypt has fulfilled that insofar as they've had lots of plans about nationals, but they have more or less remained silent on migrant communities, which arguably is problematic under this convention. The Convention on the Rights of the Child also talks about primary education and specifically says that refugee and asylum-seeking children have a right to all entitlements under that convention. So once you get there, that law does not let you differentiate. And then Egypt signed the International Convention on the Protection of All Migrant Workers and Members of Their Family. And this in some ways provides the strongest entitlement because Article 30 specifically refers to irregular migrants. However, it does not refer to refugees and asylum seekers. So in that regard, in some ways, non-national migrant children have a stronger right under this convention. International labor law talks about universal education as the best way of stopping the worst forms of child labor and exploitation. And the UNESCO Convention Against Discrimination in Education also talks about the need for compulsory primary education. Similarly, the regional framework, I'll just touch on very briefly. The African Charter on Human and People's Rights, the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, and the African Youth Charter all discuss a right to universal primary education. The African Charter on Human and People's Rights in specific says that basic education is not contingent on age, but on skill set. So an illiterate or innumerate adult would be considered not to have finished primary education and could still claim some legal entitlements. Obviously, that's not the case under the child law, but under the charter it would be. And the Charter of the Rights of the Arab Child links the right to education as being an obligation owed by Arab states and ties it into an overall shared religious framework, and Egypt has also signed that. Egypt also has bilateral agreements with Palestine where it has committed to recognizing certificates and has said it will cooperate with Ethiopia and Yemen, which, while those don't create a right to education, they do show the government's recognition of the importance of the right to education and Egypt's role in expanding it. However, the domestic legislation has been inconsistent at best. The 2014 Constitution contains the same educational rights as the previous constitutions going back to Nasser and links it to citizenship. It's a national's right. Similarly, Law 139 of 1981, which is the first education law, only addresses nationals' entitlements. It does not mention non-nationals. After Egypt created both of those laws, it then became a state party to the international laws that require it to be more progressive with non-national children. And you do start to see that. In the Child's Law, which was which was ratified in 1996, they say primary education is the right of all children. And the National Council on Motherhood and Childhood has actually played a big role in the different cluster groups on refugees and asylum seekers and migrants. They agree that the child's right is not contingent on citizenship. However, the basis of Egyptian education law for foreigners is the Egyptian Education Decree 284, which outlines the entitlements of non-nationals. Specifically says that all foreign children can enroll in private schools if they can afford them, as long as they have valid educational certificates and can pass an Arabic proficiency test. And certain nationalities can access public schools. So this is where the Sudanese fall, Libyans, Palestinians whose parents work for the government, the children of diplomats, and other specific populations. Who is not included in this population are Ethiopian nationals. And so when it comes to the legal barriers, then Ethiopians, among others, another notable one would be Iraqis and Eritreans. The legal barriers that children of non-nationals can face in Egypt, it's first of all, when Egypt signed the Refugee Convention, it made a reservation saying it did not have to give refugee children the same access to primary schools as nationals. So in most other countries, that's the applicable law. You go to the Refugee Convention, the entitlement's there. Egypt has said that that is not an obligation it's bound by, and the international community accepted that. So that's the applicable law. Also, most human rights treaties have a progressive realization standard, which means that developing countries don't have to immediately comply with the convention. There's lots of debate about exactly what the parameters are, but it does give developing countries additional time to, say, create universal primary education, and it does also allow them to differentiate between nationals and non-nationals in a way a developed state cannot. And Egypt, by consensus, does fall within the developing state framework. And lastly, and most importantly, the domestic laws conflict. While the child's law should be the most expansive, at the end of the day, what is implemented by the ministry is the ministerial decree. And so at this point in time, despite a pretty firm existence of a right to primary education in international and regional law, not all communities in Egypt can obtain that.
Yes, so taking that as a background, the fact that there is a right to education, but refugees don't really have access to education, or at least like public education in Egypt, I was very interested in the question how the new refugees access education. And so while I was reading about it, I realized that a lot of the papers and a lot of the articles I've written about it talk about either they do not have access to education or this is what we provide for them. And so I was really interested to see how refugees, and in this case Ethiopian refugees in specific, organize access to education, how refugees do that and not how it's provided for them. Because if any type of education where you look at, refugees are mostly organizing it themselves, yet no one actually highlights that. And so that was where I was interested in. And so I'll first tell a little bit about the Ethiopian refugee community in Cairo. They've been present in Cairo for quite a while. Since the 1980s, refugees have been in Cairo as Ethiopian refugees have been in Cairo as refugees, and they've come ever since then. There's been an increase in the past five years, actually. At the moment, these are the last numbers of the UNHCR: 14,564 Ethiopian refugees and asylum seekers registered with UNHCR. This is not including, for example, migrant workers or people that just did not register yet, or the closed file refugees, so people whose asylum claims have been denied yet cannot go back home, and so they're also still here. So the number is most likely higher. And so if you look at how did they come to Egypt, there are mainly two routes. The majority, actually everyone that I interviewed, came to Egypt through Sudan. But there's also a relatively large group that came through Saudi Arabia. Some of them went to Saudi Arabia as migrant workers, and then Saudi Arabia has had certain times where they would just mass deport Ethiopians, and a lot of Ethiopian people could not go back to their country, and so a large amount of them actually went to Egypt. And so this is usually how they came to Egypt. Ethiopia has a lot of ethnicities. Also inside Cairo, there are a lot of different ethnicities. The ones the people that I met were mostly Oromo, Amhara, or Tigray. hope I pronounced that correctly. And so if then look at where most of them stayed, there were mainly three areas. Most of them live in Maadi, Arab al-Maadi, or Hadayk al-Maadi. Then there is a relatively large community in Ardulua, which is here. They were mostly Tigray, so they were more ethnically closer to the Eritrean community that's also there. And then Helmiyat Zaytoum is Amhara community, which are mostly Christian Orthodox. And some people told me that, for instance, 6th of October, Arba wa Nos, or Mohandesin. But yeah, so there are like three main areas where they live. And so the Ethiopian refugee community, it's not as much one big community, it's more there are different kinds of communities. They're either based on ethnicity, there are, for example, groups like Oromo groups, or political affiliations, religion. And so there are different types of groups. And then there are 4 CBOs, so there are 4 community-based organizations, which are not directly connected to all ethnicities. There are 3 that are Oromo community organizations, and there's one for all Ethiopians in general. All CBOs are situated inside Arab al-Maadi. And so I noticed that, for example, people that live in Ardulua or in Helmiyat Zaytoum, they're more connected through the church, for example. That's what that worked as their community, for example. And there were 2 things that stood out for me. First of all, there's a relatively large number of unaccompanied migrants or refugees from the Ethiopians. And no one could really tell me why, but there was a very large group of unaccompanied minors, and there are a lot of single mothers in the Ethiopian community. And so when I looked at the access to education, the very few things that were written about it, it said they either go to the Sudanese community schools or they go to the church-run schools. But once I started asking, a lot of people told me they either had their children enrolled in Sudanese schools and they pulled them out, or they would never enroll their kids in Sudanese schools because they were really afraid for it. And then there's, for example, STARS or African Hope. They both have Ethiopian refugees, but they also both told me there's actually a relatively small group of Ethiopian refugees that go to these schools. And besides, for example, STARS is not really situated in an area where a lot of refugees live, so for a lot of people it's actually really expensive to bring their children to the school. For example, there was a family with 4 children, and they lived close to Helmiyat Zaytoum, and it takes like £7 to go there, £7 back, and so it's a lot of money to put your kids there. So what most people that I interviewed actually had their kids enrolled in more local to the neighborhood schools. There was one Ethiopian school that existed. It was from OVA. It's one of the community-based organizations. And the school got established in 2016. It was specifically established because the community requested that there would be a school for Ethiopian refugees because parents said their children are discriminated, they don't want to send their kids to school, they don't feel comfortable. And so it's a very new school. It's for Oromo refugees mostly. And it just needs to, it just started. But yeah, most of those kids actually went to the Sudanese community schools before, and now they go to the OVA school. Then a lot of people that I interviewed actually said they brought their kids to the Nigerian schools. I thought it was a very interesting school because I'd never heard of it, and I tried reading on it, and there was nothing written on the Nigerian schools, and I never knew anything about the Nigerian schools. As far as the ones that I interviewed, there are around 5 in Cairo, and even though they're not related to each other, they're all called Nigerian schools. Most of them started off as, actually all of them started off as nurseries, and as they went on, they realized that their students had nowhere to go, and so they started adding years after years after years. And so some of them at the moment are considering setting up secondary school, because after they're done with the primary school, they still have no place to go. And so the kids that go to these schools are from all refugee groups, except the Sudanese and the Syrians, because they have their own schools. And the largest groups that go to these schools are actually the Ethiopians and the South Sudanese. why are they called Nigerian schools? They're not really actually Nigerian children at the school. But they told me either the owners of the school are Nigerian or the teachers used to be Nigerian, and so that's why they go by the name of Nigerian schools. Even though when I asked them about it, they were like, no, we're not Nigerian school. But this is how everyone refers to them. And then there was a relatively large amount of people that told me that their children or people that they knew went to nurseries, even up until they were 12 years old, because there were no other education opportunities, and so they enrolled their children in nurseries, and they would just go there till they were older, and so they learned how to read, how to write. And these type of nurseries, or any type of nurseries, they would go to Egyptian nurseries, maybe Coptic nurseries, Sudanese nurseries, any type of nurseries. So yeah, I thought was really interesting. And so education is something really important to people, and it's very much a very big part of life. And so I saw that there were a lot of connection between education and, for example, the community. So like the community helped organizing education. Like for example, with the Over Community School, the community requested a school, and then the school was set up by the community, and it's run by the community. It's mostly funded by the community. And I heard that in other groups too. I know at the Amhara refugee community, for example, they would rent apartments out, and they would just get like a class for a couple of weeks. And also they would inform each other. They would say, hey, here's a good school, my child's going to this school, maybe you want to change your child to this school. So the community was really important in organizing education and finding ways to access education. And at the same time, if you would change it, you saw that education is also very important for the community. For example, the Arabic classes that the children get are important. And for example, by the Over Community School, they would, because they're in an area where there are a lot of other schools, and they said when our children are having issues, we would set them down, we would talk, we'd create understanding, both from the Egyptian children and from the Ethiopian children. And so in both ways, I think it was very important. And then another thing that I thought was interesting is that education and life in general, or life past experience, the current life experience, are very important for education. For example, the Sudanese community schools, a lot of parents told me like, oh no, I don't want to send my child to Sudanese schools because they were afraid of Sudan, or because what they went through when they came from Sudan, or for what they're experiencing at the moment, because some of them live in neighborhoods where Sudanese gangs are running the streets, and so they're really afraid of it, and so they're like, no, I would not send my children there. I'm afraid of that. My child might get abducted. Some of them had never enrolled their children in Sudanese community school, and they couldn't really pinpoint who then the Sudanese were, but they just referred to that as the Sudanese, and so that's why they did not want to send their children to Sudanese schools. And then at the same time, the future was very important. A lot of parents were like, I have never had education, so I want my children to have education, even though it might not be good education, but I want my children to have a certain type of education. And others were like, I'm not sure what the future will bring. I'm not sure where I'm going to go. And so I just really want my children to go to school, that at least they have some type of education. And then there was a third group that very specifically said, I want my children to go to English-speaking schools, because later on I'm going to go to Canada, or I'm going to go to Australia, and then my children already know English. It is important why my children go to school. And so if we look at education in general, it was very much a choice. Like Claire said, there is a right to education, but it's not, in Egypt it's really hard, and they don't really have access to education, and parents could have been like, oh, okay, well then there's no right, then there's no access. But parents specifically chose to put their children into school. It was a very specific choice. And so it was not just the choice for education, but also the type of education was a choice. Like I said, for example, some parents specifically wanted to enroll their children into an English-speaking school because they thought English was more useful than later on, for example. Others very specifically chose to enroll their children, for example, in a religious school, in a Christian school, because they didn't want their children to go to a school where they had to learn about Islam and then they would get confused, for example. And so they said, I prefer for my children to go to a Christian school. And at the same time, I heard it from Muslims that they said my child gets confused because, for example, he has to go to a Christian school, and so he gets confused about what he's learning. So it worked both ways. And then some chose for safety. And so the question of quality I thought was very important, because some people, it depends on what they thought to be more important. And so one mother that I met, she said, yeah, my child is in a nursery. Yes, he's 8 years old. I think he should go to primary school, but that means that he has to go to Sudanese school, and I want my child to be safe. So she said, I prefer for him to be ignorant than to go to a school where he's not safe. And so she kept her child in his other school. And so on other times, people would actually pull the children out of school because they said, I want them to go to it's a more expensive school, but it's a better quality school, and I think quality is very important. So they would then pull the children out of school and put in a different school. And then lastly, I thought the question of Arabic was very interesting, because the few things that you read about it, they say it's specifically for the Ethiopian refugees, it's hard because they don't speak Arabic, and so it's really hard for them to access education. Whereas a lot of the children actually spoke fluent Arabic. And so it wasn't as much that I didn't want the children to learn Arabic, it was more as that in the future they were most likely going to learn English, and so they preferred for the children to already learn English. Because most children spoke Arabic, and they thought it was important. And one mother very specifically said, like, I want my child to learn in English school because in the future we're going to go to Canada, but it's very important for my child to also learn Arabic, and so she also needs to learn Arabic. So yeah, that was interesting. And so at the end, education was really a way to reclaim citizenship. The refugee experience, fleeing is already a part of there are like certain citizenship rights that you don't have access to, and that's why you're fleeing. The entire refugee experience is about your citizenship rights, and then they come to Egypt and they don't have access to education, so they're claiming their own access to education and their own citizenship rights. And so through this, I thought it kind of changed from weak or helpless refugees to actually people that are just people, and like, because if I would read about education, it was more as like, this is what's provided for them. They were very passive. Whereas I think if you look at education, it's very active. They're very actively searching for education and like the type of education. It's not as much a passive as what's always written about.
As we look at how you would combine the legal aspect and we're jokingly calling it reality, but what it is on the ground, what the communities are telling us. One thing that really strikes me is that because the law is so state-centric or individual-centric, there's not much room for communities. And so the question of the right to education becomes based on each individual child, not on nationalities or neighborhoods or communities. And I think what it kind of erases is that the right to education in refugees ends up kind of being seen as an issue that's different from education more generally. And the same motivators Anouk was talking about for how people choose school, the quality, the language of instruction, a preference for schools that reflect their religious or cultural beliefs, those are the same things driving every school choice debate internationally. And so somehow differentiating between refugee education or just education more generally, I think would be problematic. And also the importance of the community schools, and the community's voice. Because again, I think if you go to the conversations about education policy, I don't think they very often have done a great job of bringing the community voices into the picture.
Okay. Yes, thank you for these insights in education in Cairo. It just came to my mind that law also is something which is negotiated every time out. It's nothing which is static, and it's also something probably that can change. Would you think that you this kind of organizing schools could also change or somehow reach to the law?
I was going to say, as recently as this year, the law came close to changing. So it would not surprise me if the formal aspect of the entitlement could go back and forth depending on both international conventions and then also just agreements between the UN and different states. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Has anyone a question? I wanted to open it first to the audience.
These schools over the years, and have they sought that help out, and what was sort of the response that they got? If you could comment on that.
Interesting. It's kind of sad. I think last year, UNHCR said, the Egyptian government said all community schools need to close. And so they closed 2 community schools, and all community schools thought they were going to get closed. And then UNHCR was like, oh no, we're good. We're going to keep them open. And from that moment on, UNHCR has stopped funding. So over at the moment, they told me they showed me this is a chair that we've gotten from these organizations gave us a chair, these organizations gave us this. So they would give them certain things, but not no real funding. And I would ask them about funding, and they mostly did through the community got the money together. And so the school is inside their community building. And all the teachers are volunteers, so they keep the costs very low. But yeah, it's mostly just funded through the community.
Any other question? Yes, please.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I'd be interested in how you gain access to the community and in which language you conducted your research.
So I knew some people that worked either with the community or friends that met that knew them. And from inside there, I have people translate for me or help me. And so I spoke English because I do speak English. But yeah, there were a lot of people that were very helpful to me that would help me translate for me from the different communities. So yeah.
Hi. It sounds like both of you picked up on the idea of quality of education, and I'd be curious to hear both of you speak more about it. Claire, could you talk about, are there international frameworks that focus on quality at all, or other perhaps national models that are interesting? And then Anouk, what did people most focus on when they're talking about quality of education? What did that mean to them?
Legally, most of the conventions do then go on to talk about the quality of education, but when it comes to in practice, the binding nature is much more with the ability to go and less with the ability to lead with a specific learning outcome. I actually specifically find the African conventions, the different frameworks have just a fascinating, the very second aspect of the right to education under the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child is fostering respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, preserving and strengthening positive African morals. So there is usually a list of what would constitute the correct quality of education, but it's seen as secondary to making sure people can enroll. And I think there are pros and cons. You can't get the quality education unless you can go, but if you go and the quality is subpar, particularly if there are safety issues or whatnot, then you also beg the question of why is this the focus? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I thought the question for quality was very interesting because people would tell me like the quality isn't good, and I would ask what about the quality isn't good? What do you want to be better? And I couldn't really get a straight answer. But like I said, for example, English for them, for most, is really important because no one intends to stay in Egypt, and so no one intended to use Arabic after Egypt. And so that was related to quality. The type of classes that were taught was often mentioned, and like religion, for example, I thought was very important, was very interesting. Because a lot of them would tell me, like, in Ethiopia we do not have religion inside the school, and so they were very confused. It was very difficult for them to accept that their child would learn Islamic things inside the school, or would learn about Christianity inside their school. Yeah, like the discrimination aspect was also related to the quality. The Sudanese community schools were often like they were discriminated, and therefore the quality wasn't good. Yeah, I thought that was. Yes.
Sorry if I missed this. If the class is not in English, what language is it in?
So most of them are in Arabic. The Sudanese schools are in Arabic. The Nigerian schools are in English. And most of them learn French as a second language. And all of them have Arabic as one of the classes. It gets either Arabic or English. African Hope is in English, STARS is in English. It's just the Sudanese schools that are usually in Arabic. And the OVA, they told me they're teaching in English, but I was pretty sure I didn't hear English. So I think it's all Oromo. There was one person walking around, she kept talking in Arabic. It was very interesting because the kids didn't understand her that well. But yeah, so it's usually English or Arabic.
And then, sorry, where do they get their curriculum or their like textbook material from?
So they're teaching, most of them are teaching the Sudanese curriculum because a couple of years ago, I think 10 years or something, there was an agreement that if they learn Sudanese curriculum, they get to sit in on the exams at the Sudanese embassy. And so they get an acknowledged certificate, which would allow them to go to university, for example. That's often not the case. But yeah, technically most of them teach the Sudanese curriculum. The Nigerian school that I visited taught the Nigerian curriculum, the American curriculum with Nigerian curriculum added to it. But I wasn't 100% sure about that because she wasn't very clear what they were exactly teaching. But yeah, most of them are Sudanese curriculum.
Maybe when you're talking about the curriculum, can you tell us a little bit more about how is it organized? I mean, how many students are attending the schools? How many classes? What is the content of the classes besides language?
I'm not 100% sure what all they were teaching. Like English, all of them were teaching English, Arabic, math. Because this is what some of the parents were telling me. The classes they were teaching weren't a lot, so it was like math, English, some classes French. Very basic, I think. The schools were, it depends on which school it was. Some community schools were really large, some of them were quite small. I think OVA had between 100 and 200, very broad range. And African Hope, I think, was a little bit larger. It really depended on the school. The Nigerian school had a lot of children, and they said they were definitely on their limit. They had classes from like 30, 35, 40 children, so they were.
So like each school has like 100 to 200 kids?
Yes.
Okay, it's quite a number, I would say.
Yeah.
Any more questions? No, yes, there are two.
I'm just curious, were these the Nigerian schools, I don't know if you sort of put together a good record of them or whatever, but are they particularly concentrated in a neighborhood of Cairo, or are they sort of just scattered around?
So, because there was no information about it for me, I had to hear from people. So I heard 3 different schools that were in Arab and Mahdi, and one of them, one dad told me his children went to Nigerian school, and he lived in Hamid Sutun, so it's somewhere up there. And then I asked one of the teachers in the Nigerian school, and she said, I don't know, I don't interact with any of the Nigerian schools, which is apparently all called Nigerian schools. But yeah, she knew that there were 3 in Imadi, and so the point of them were that they were really in the neighborhood where the refugees lived, so that they could walk to school. They didn't have to pay for the transportation. And that's the thing, the OVA also specifically said children walk to school because transportation is usually really expensive.
Okay. Thank you for the invitation. My name is Wijtsma. I'm with Mambara. We are here representing the Ethiopian Refugee Committee in Egypt. I think I think you wrote everything we said, and you are our voice with this research, and thank you for that. My question is that did you ask any suggestion or any comment from the Egyptian government on this topic or on this research? That is my first question. The second one is that we try to provide primary education inside our community. We have a computer for adults, computer class, English class, and Arabic class for the adults. But we asked UNHCR and IOM for an assistance for opening a primary school, but they told us that they don't have any financial or funds to support our community. So that's how we stopped providing. That's how we couldn't start the primary school education. So I just want to put this in on your opinion. I think. Do you have any question? No. Okay.
Just I'd like to say thank you so much. Really, I'm very appreciative. For our money, this is problem also for us. It's a really very important thing. Really, thank you so much. I'm very appreciate. This is all challenge for my challenge. It's a really very big problem, especially for language. In the most of important thing for Arabic language, that's a big problem. Also for I put it for Nigerian school is not like very well speak for English. That's a big problem. Maybe I don't know. He's trying to change it for also English language. He's not affected very well. He's broken all. Sometimes I cannot understand. He speak for me. That is really I'm very appreciative. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Sammy, I do have a last question maybe. You were talking about 2016, about the rumor that the government wants to shut down all this kind of schools. It wasn't 2016 or 2017, I'm not sure. 17, yes. But then you said it didn't happen. Only 2 schools were closed. Do you have any idea how this shift came and why?
There were multiple reasons that they told me. No one gave me a clear answer, but some of them said because there was issues between Sudan and Egypt, that Sudan was like, we're not accrediting these schools anymore, and so that's why they were closed, and it got better between Sudan and Egypt, and they were like, we can continue opening it. But there was absolutely, no one gave me a reason why. They opened it again. Maybe they realized that it's going to be too much of an issue because maybe the Sudanese and the Syrians could be mainstreamed into the education system, but like for example the Ethiopians or the Somalis or Eritreans, it's a lot harder for them, and they by law are not allowed to go into the schools, and so maybe that's why. What I heard, they're just really surprised by it. Like all community schools were the ones I talked to, they were just really surprised that it stopped and no one really knew why.
But you also said that the UNHCR was stopping funding?
Yeah, they stopped funding. Yeah, they're not funding anymore. Yeah, which I don't understand how they funded it to begin with. But now they're like, no, they're not legal anymore. So we can't fund them anymore. So they're not funding any schools. That's what they told me. But to be your question, by the way, sorry. I did not talk to any governments or about education. But I know Claire's is working on a project where maybe you want to say something about that.
Yeah, as our project continues to go along, the EU project, we are in the process of setting up the opportunities to discuss because we're not only looking at the right to education, we're looking at 7 other entitlements. So we're hoping to have the ability to sit with the relevant government bodies. And so it's a process, but it has seemed to be, the government has seemed to be receptive to, hopefully we'll get to discuss just the legal framework at some point.
Okay, I do have one last question. You have been saying in the beginning, like, that mostly there are always reports about the refugees and about the education and about what is the labor about it. And it's not really that much written about like a refugee center, like from another perspective. What was the most interesting part? What you realized during your research, what you did not read in any other report before?
In general, I was just, I mean, my research was to look at how refugees organize themselves, but I was just even more, I don't know, surprised is not the right word. I thought it was really interesting that the amount of effort people put into enrolling their children into school. And for example, I come from a country where everyone has access to education, and we don't really like it. People just skip school. And it was so important that people just went to an extent that I'm not even sure I would go to that extent to find schools. Parents would work 2-3 jobs to enroll their children in a school. So I thought that was even more than I thought was going to be. So I thought that was really cool.
From Anouk's research, what struck me the most was that I had never seen anything really written about education choices that took into account past experiences, future plans. The literature tends to be very focused on like the temporal confines of when someone would be a refugee, and that all other considerations don't tend to make it into the literature as well. So the stories Anouk told of how people's personal journeys impacted school choice is something I think really needs to be better reflected in the literature.
Yes, and also future plans.
Yes.
Yes. So, if there is no other question, I would say thank you very much. There is still coffee and water and some seats over there. Then we can go over into personal talk. I would say thank you very much. I really enjoyed reading her whole master thesis. And I know that they are going to do further research, the 2 of them, on it. And I think it's research which is much needed here. Thank you.